Okay friends, to get started on our job, one of the first things we have to do is remove all 5 of our lug nuts and then remove the wheel. With that off, let's go ahead and spray this down with some penetrant. Next, we're going to push in the caliper piston. I'm just going to take my pry bar and carefully come in between the caliper and the bracket itself and gently pry. Go ahead and remove your 2 caliper slider bolts. Remove both of those. Next, we're going to remove the caliper. Once you get the caliper off there, you're probably going to notice that your pads are trying to come out. That's because of these springs. We want to go ahead and remove these from the pads, and then remove the pads from the brackets. Now let's remove our caliper bracket bolts. Leave that in there just a couple threads. Remove your bracket, set it aside. Now we're going to take off our 2 mounting bolts that hold the rotor to the bearing itself. Set that aside so you can reuse it. At this point, be careful because there's nothing holding your rotor on. Put on one of your lug nuts a little bit, and then we're going to hit right along this area here just to cause some vibration and break this free. Be careful not to hit your wheel studs. Remove your rotor. Let's move along to removing the bracket for our brake hose. Next, we're going to remove the axle nut right here. What you might notice if you're working with hand tools is as you try to loosen this is going to try to spin. If you have this closer to the ground, you could take a nice pry bar, come across your lug studs without damaging them, put it down to the ground, and that's going to help prevent this from spinning. With that said, let's remove our axle nut. A little bit of penetrant. Now we're going to use a punch and a hammer, come right in through the center here and break this free. If that doesn't work, commonly people will use an air chisel. Remove your locking cotter pin and then remove the nut. Leave this on a couple threads, give this a couple loving bonks, break it free. Looking at the back side of the knuckle, you're going to find your ABS wire, which leads down to your ABS sensor. I want to remove the mounting bolt for that and then carefully remove this from the knuckle. Inspect it, make sure it's not damaged in any way, and then set it aside so it's safe. Go ahead and remove this nut, and then we're going to break it free. Keep in mind, this thing could potentially come down, possibly hurt you, and even if you don't have this separated properly, you might put a tug on your axle. Leave that on there a couple threads. Let's give it a couple loving bonks. Let's go ahead and separate this. Now that we have this down, and of course the axle is broken free, I'm going to continue on to removing this bolt that comes through the lower control arm area here. To drive this through, I'm just going to use the nut, screw it on there a couple threads, and then give it a couple loving bonks. After that, you can either pull it out by hand or of course use a punch if needed. Get the axle out of this area. Next, we're going to get underneath the car. We have to remove this skid shield right here, and then we're going to remove the axle from the transmission. To remove the shield, we need to remove all of the mounting bolts. You can see a couple of them along here. Just get them all out of there and then remove the shield. Now we're going to go ahead and pop the axle out of the transmission itself. We want to be very careful not to damage the seal right here, and also you want to think about the fact you might have fluid come out, so have a nice collection bucket underneath. With that broken free, I'm just going to go ahead and start getting the axle out of here. You're going to notice that it gets caught in this little area here, or the wishbone of the front strut. If I just go ahead and pull down on this, typically you can get it so you can get the axle shaft right out of there. There it is, friends. Once your axle's out of there, take a quick look at that seal right there. You want to inspect it, make sure it's in good condition. If it's damaged in any way, you're going to have to go ahead and remove the axle to replace the seal. So if it's damaged, now's the time to replace it. Okay, now it's time to install our brand new CV axle. A couple things to pay attention to is, of course, the CV boots here. You don't want to damage these during installation. Just going to bring it up in here and get this out of the way. Get this so it's semi-lined up along this area here. We can even start it right into the transmission. Should want to slide right in there. All right, now I'm just going to grab myself a rubber mallet and I'll give this a couple loving bonks to drive it in. Get this as straight as possible. All right, let's just double check it. Make sure it's completely seated around where it meets into the transmission. That looks pretty great. Now we can continue on by putting this wishbone back onto the lower control arm. There we are. Now before we continue on by pushing the axle all the way in, let's just apply a little bit of copper never seize. Okay, now we can start lining this up and put that bolt through as well. Once it's started, go ahead and bottom it out and then torque it to 76 foot-pounds. Carefully slide the axle into the wheel bearing itself. Then we're going to insert the upper ball joint into the knuckle. Start the nut on there, we'll bottom it out, and then torque it to manufacturer's specifications. When we snug this, we only want to go a little bit because we're going to be torquing it to 35 foot-pounds. Let's get the outer tie rod into the knuckle here. Start the nut on there. Now let's start torquing everything. Your upper ball joint, torque it to 35 foot-pounds. Now it's time for the tie rod, 35 foot-pounds as well. Now let's torque these two to 148 foot-pounds. Reinstall your ABS sensor. Pay attention to the little piton right there. You want to make sure that that lines up with the hole, and of course the bolt lines up with the bolt hole. Make sure it's nice and snug. Let's get our flex hose bracket reattached and snug that up as well. Now it's time to get the axle nut on there. Now we're going to torque the axle nut to 189 foot-pounds. I have my bar going across here because of course I want to make sure that this doesn't spin. The next thing we want to do is make sure that we peen this nut down right into the slot on the axle. The reason for that is, of course, it's going to lock it in for us so it doesn't loosen up while we're driving. Perfect. It's time to get our shield back up there. Pay attention to the back side. You have your little hooky-doo right there. It's going to slide into this slot. Once you have it up there, go ahead and line up all of your bolt holes and start them in, then snug them up. Apply copper never seize along the mating surface of your bearing. Putting the rotor on here, of course you want to make sure that the mounting holes line up. Start in both of your mounting bolts here. And then make sure they're tight. Let's go ahead and put it onto the car. We'll start in both of our caliper bracket bolts, snug them up, and then torque them to 66 foot-pounds. Now it's time to install our brake pads. Something to pay attention to is one of your pads for each side is going to have a wear indicator. We want that to be on the inboard pad, so the one on the inside. Also, I want to have it facing towards the bottom on this application. Do the same to the other pad now. Carefully slide this in here. There we are. Now we're going to go ahead and lubricate the caliper itself. Go right along the metal aspect of the piston right here. Once you have plenty of lube on that, we're going to continue on to the backside of both of these ears. Once again, adding this lubricant helps with vibration dampening and noise reduction. You'll notice your kit came with brand new springs right here. When you go ahead and put these in, you want to make sure that you hold onto the pads, because what these springs are supposed to do is release the pad from the rotor. Do the same to the lower one here. Make sure you hold your pads, like I said, and let's slide the caliper right over the area. Start in both of your caliper slider bolts. To tighten these up, I'm just going to go ahead and grab onto the slider so it can't spin. We'll snug it, and then we'll torque it to 20 foot-pounds. Now we can go ahead and put the wheel on here. We'll start all the lug nuts on, snug them up, get the wheel on the ground, and then torque the lug nuts to 98 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay friends, so we finished up our left front axle. What's left to do now? You're going to get under the hood and you're going to double check your transmission fluid. Make sure it's full. If it isn't, just go ahead and top it off with some Mercron LV fluid. Aside from that, go ahead and take it for a road test down to your local alignment shop.